Hi, this is Lew Rockwell, and I know you'll enjoy hearing this show.
Welcome back to Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I'm your host, Jay Taylor, and I'm really pleased to have with me Lew Rockwell. Mr. Rockwell is an American libertarian political commentator, activist, proponent of the Austrian School of Economics, and chairman and CEO of the Ludwig von Mises Institute in Auburn, Alabama. And he is the author of The Left, the Right, and the State. It was a book that was written in 2008. Lew served as Ron Paul's congressional chief of staff from 1978 to 1982 and was closely associated with his teacher and colleague Murray Rothbard until Rothbard's death in 1995. He also is vice president of the Center for Libertarian Studies in Burlingame, California, and publisher of the political weblog LewRockwell.com. And I would also like to strongly suggest to my listeners that they go to Mises.org to avail themselves to top Austrian economic economists and writers, libertarians, people that provide, I think, what made our country great, the ideas of our founding fathers. So, again, that's Mises.org. Well, welcome, Lew. Welcome to Turning Hard Times into Good Times.
Hey, Jay, great to be with you.
Really good to have you. I see that as a reflection of my own libertarian Austrian economic views, this show has really a free market leaning since its inception back in 2009. But we have not really had a formal discussion of Austrian economics, I would say. I think we've sort of generally, people probably have an idea of what Austrian economics is, but maybe you can help us focus a little more definitively on Austrian economics. So I'd like to, if you don't mind, ask you a little bit to define Austrian economics for our listeners and perhaps contrast that with Keynesian economics and monetarist economics.
I'm not going to get too technical because I don't want to put anybody to sleep. So let me put this in what I hope will be an interesting fashion. Think of the Austrian school as being the purest form of free market economics. That is, it's the view of the school that the less the government has to do with the economy, the better off we are, the more prosperous and the freer. And in fact, it should have zero to do with the economy. Mm-hmm. You can think of Keynesian economics as what Joe Salerno calls the economics of government power. In an Austrian sense, we think society does not need overlords, that people are capable of running their own lives, making their own decisions, promoting their own prosperity, and developing a capitalist economy based on the division of labor and more specialization, more and more investment and savings. That's what builds not only human prosperity, but civilization itself. To the Keynesians, their stated view is that to sort of think of the economy as a truck running down a hill, and if the government's not there stepping on the brake and shifting and steering it, why it's going to go off and crash. Mm-hmm. Of course, it's actually the government that causes it to go off and crash. Mm-hmm. The monetarists have their origin in Keynesianism. They are more free market than the Keynesians, although they're far from being entirely free market. But their one major problem is that they believe in the Federal Reserve. They believe that it's the government's job, and it's a wonderful thing for society to have this bankster monopoly creating money for the benefit of the government and the benefit of the big banks and other institutions, part of the governing oligarchy and close to the government. That's a good thing. It's, of course, not a good thing. It's the ripoff. It's maybe the greatest ripoff in the history of the world, the Federal Reserve. Just looking at the present time, we have, as you pointed out, we have Keynesianism dominating everything, not only the way the government runs the economy, not only what the Federal Reserve does, what all the media say, what mainstream academia says, big business says. Keynes came back in 2008 after a bubble created by the Federal Reserve, came back with a vengeance. So very unfortunate thing. And the government, and we can think of what happened after 9/11 as another example of this. The government is the one institution in society, or maybe over society, that when it falls flat on its face in a total disaster of its own making, and it messes everything up to an unbelievable degree, why the answer is to give them more money and more power.
Yeah.
So that was the view in 2008. But one of the things the Austrians are responsible for, Mises, Hayek, Rothbard, is the view that the business cycle is not something that's natural to the economy. It's not something that just happens, but rather it's the result of intervention, and it's the result of intervention into the banking system by creating money, by lowering interest rates, thereby below the market rate, thereby leading to all kinds of investments that turn out not to have been very smart. when things stop. And then you have unemployment, you have systemic bankruptcies because of the bubble. So they set out after 9/11, Greenspan and Bush and the rest of them, to create a housing bubble. I mean, that was their specific, remember Paul Krugman calling for this. Right. This was their specific intention. So they created a bubble. The bubble, of course, burst, as all bubbles eventually do. Now it looks like they're creating another bubble. Housing, at least in some areas, there's apparently a new housing bubble going on in Southern California, Northern California, Miami, and a few other areas. I don't think they can create a nationwide bubble like they did before, but they can certainly cause a lot more trouble, a lot more heartache, a lot more poverty and dispossessions. If we look at not only Western Europe, but in the United States, we have the banks running everything. We sort of live in a bankocracy. The Austrians would say fractional reserve banking, which is what all of banking is today, is an illegitimate system. It's part and parcel of the inflation system and of the causing of recessions and depressions through these artificial bubbles. If even a significant proportion of the depositors of any bank wouldn't ask for their money, the whole thing would come down unless the Federal Reserve turns on the printing press, which of course is what they do. But that has other bad effects, of course.
Well, indeed. So essentially what the Austrians are saying is that if the economy was left alone, you wouldn't have bubbles, but the government gets involved, creates bubbles either through monetary policy or through regulatory interference in the markets, so the markets can't naturally clear. And so what governments do is they create the bubbles, and then they need to create a bigger bubble to try to solve the problems caused by the previous bubble. Is that it?
Not only in terms of bubbles, but in terms of all government intervention. Mises pointed this out. So the government intervenes, it causes a problem. They then use that problem as a reason to justify more intervention.
Right.
They never say, "Oh, we messed up, let's pull back."
No. So in fact, this is one of the things that's been very clear to me about the current policies following the Lehman Brothers problem. We didn't learn anything from the 1930s, it seems to me. I know Murray Rothbard talked about in his book about the Great Depression that in fact it seems to me that we're repeating the same policies, only more so this time. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and in fact, there's never been anything like this present system. There's never been in the history of the world a time when every country had a central bank. Every central bank had a so-called discretionary monetary policy. There's nothing inhibiting them. There's no even semi-gold standard. And all the banks are inflating together under the aegis of the Federal Reserve. So you have the European Central Bank, the Bank of Switzerland, the Bank of England, the Bank of China, Bank of Japan. They're all inflating together, and we're definitely in uncharted territory.
Right.
What exactly is going to happen and when it's going to happen, that's the job of the entrepreneur or the good investor to try to figure out. But I think we can be sure it's bad.
It's a daunting task, and I want to get into, some of the causes, some of the ideas that you have regarding where we might be heading. But just a couple more definitions, if I could. What about supply side economics, which was in vogue during Reagan's term? Supply side economics, is that not? Are there some things in common with Austrian economics, free market economics, or not?
No, I mean it's another variant of Keynesianism, and it's a reason that supply siders, for example, said deficits don't matter.
We had that.
They ran huge deficits under Reagan. The government was expanded massively. Reagan cut taxes once, increased them 6 times. The government ended up much bigger after his term of office was over than when he began. So it was all a fraud. He didn't cut the government. He didn't overall cut taxes. He vastly increased taxes, not only Social Security taxes, but his horrific TEFRA, T-E-F-R-A tax increase in 1986. He increased gasoline taxes. He was a fraud. We have the Democratic frauds. We have the Republican frauds. So Ronald Reagan was a limited government guy or a free market guy in the same sense that Mitt Romney was. In other words, no sense.
Yeah. Well, at a recent event that your Mises Institute held in New York, I attended it.
We were glad to have you there.
David Stockman was a speaker there. He was very much a part of the Reagan administration. Would you consider him a supply sider? And he certainly was very, very critical in his speech that he gave there in New York about what's going on now. Said he believes that the capital markets are about to be completely destroyed by what's going on with the Fed. But would you consider David Stockman, is he a supply sider?
No, and he's far too smart to be a supply sider. And if you have to remember that he was fired as head of the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, because he said the whole thing was phony. They were lying about what they were doing, and they were lying about their projections, their so-called rosy scenarios. And so he was fired. He was fired for telling the truth, which, of course, is always a bad idea in the government.
If you want to retain your job in government, right?
David is, I would say, not an Austrian, but he's influenced these days by Austrian economics. And he's working on a fantastic new book on crony capitalism and the markets and what's ahead of us. And I've seen part of it, and it's quite extraordinary.
Yeah, so he told me and promised me that he'll consider coming on this show when he's finished. I'm really looking forward to the book in any event. Well, okay, so what about, let's talk about Ludwig von Mises, the name. I mean, the Mises Institute was named after him. In fact, I believe maybe was a direct outcome of his being, right? Give us a little history on the Mises Institute, how it was formed.
Well, I had the great honor as a young kid of being Mises' editorial assistant for the republication of some of his books that had been out of print, and also for publication of a new work at Arlington House Publishers, which was in those days the only book publisher that was interested in libertarian or Austrian-related books. And I became concerned in the years after that, and especially after his death, that the Austrian school and Mises as a man, as well as a great economist, perhaps the greatest economist, that he was losing stature. And I thought this was a man whose heroic story we needed to know, because we all need people to emulate. And he was definitely a man worth emulating. Also one of the great geniuses, I would argue, of the West. I thought that he was becoming less well known. So I thought it was very important, not only for the cause of justice, but for the future of prosperity and capitalism and freedom, that the Austrian school be revivified and the story of Mises be told and his significance be told. So that's why I started the Institute. I approached Margaret von Mises, his widow, asked her if she would be chairman of our board, and she said that she would agree to do it if I would agree to do this for the rest of my life. So I gave her that. I gave her my word. Margaret never hesitated to ask that way. She was a very direct lady. And so then I approached Murray Rothbard and asked him if he would head our academic affairs, and he was so happy about it, he actually clapped his hands in glee. I mean, it was the only time I ever saw anybody do that, but because he had been Mises' student and colleague, he loved Mises as a man as well as an economist and historian. So he agreed to do everything he could, and so this is 30 years ago, a little more than 30 years ago.
Wow.
So I've had a lot of fun since. I got help from some magnificent donors, obviously, people like that who make everything possible, great scholars. And today, the Austrian school is still, of course, very much a minority school, but it's a far bigger minority than it used to be. We have many more economists, many, many more students. And the most recent great thing is that, in fact, Ron Paul was also one of the very early people supporting the Institute, and he was gracious enough to help us raise some seed money in the very early days, and has always been a good supporter. And what he has done in his last two presidential campaigns to spread the word about Austrian economics, never been anything like that in history. All around the world, he's interested, I would argue, if we look at the whole world, millions of young people in Austrian economics. So where do they go? They go to Mises.org. People will find everything from things for lay people, a massive, great material for. By the way, I should mention that Austrian economics is literary economics. It's not mathematical economics.
Yes, that's very important.
Illegitimate anyway. But if you look at an economics journal, if you're a regular person, it's just entirely unintelligible. Sure. That's not true of Austrian economics. It's accessible to the intelligent layman. So we have on Mises.org thousands of books, all for free, videos, audios, thousands of hours of lectures and other kinds of programs, all kinds of articles and papers. So take a look at it, make use of it. Of course, we sell books too, but all our books are available for free download. You can read them on screen or download on your printer and print them out. That's, of course, a pretty expensive way to do it, but we find that people in some countries where it's difficult to get the books, difficult even to import the books, they're able to print out the books. Right. And so we circumvent some restrictions. So everything is there, and we want to serve these young people that Ron Paul has called forth.
Indeed, and it's actually, Ron is very popular around the world too. It's not just in the United States among younger people. It's pretty surprising. People that I've run into in different places around the world who are aware of him, and as a result, Austrian economics. And speaking of some of these great Austrian economists, then help me understand a little bit the difference, or maybe some of the contributions that various people, leaders in this thought, for example, Murray Rothbard, Henry Hazlitt, or F.A. Hayek. What do some of these different people, what have they offered? What specifically, let's say, was Murray Rothbard known for?
Well, Murray Rothbard, in terms of Austrian economics, building on Mises and his predecessors, because really the roots of the Austrian school go back into the time of the late scholastics in the 14th and 15th century. This is where it all began. It formally began at University of Vienna in the 1870s. Certainly Mises was the key figure. I might just mention that he was the first person before the founding of the Federal Reserve to demonstrate in his theory of money and credit that an institution like the Fed would be a poverty-producing, chaotic disaster. As far as the free market and regular people, of course, there are other people who benefit, but how it would bring about a business cycle. He also was the only man thoroughly to show in 1920 why communism and socialism would be, again, a total poverty-producing and really civilization-destroying disaster because there could be no price system in capital goods. He totally reconstructed economics on the basis of individual human action, that we have to understand all of economics, starting with the individual, not with the group, not with the class, not with the country and all that sort of thing, but with the individual in his great book, Human Action. And I'm only scratching the surface. I mean, he wrote 25 books and hundreds of articles. And then Rothbard also, again, wrote more than 20 books and perhaps 10,000 articles, Rothbard. I mean, these men so prolific.
Many of which are available at Mises.org, no doubt.
Yeah, no, we have books and articles, not all of them yet, but many of them. They're all there, and you'll find Rothbard, if you've not read him, is just the most scintillating, interesting writer, just tremendous. So there's all kinds of historical stuff by Murray, economic things, political analysis, just extraordinary, and his work in the business cycle, America's Great Depression, his book, Man, Economy, and State, which set out to be, he was originally commissioned to do a textbook of human action, but typical of Rothbard, he actually improved on human action. Not only is Man, Economy, and State more systematic and more one part following another, but he actually improved on Mises in a few areas. He wrote a 5-volume history of the colonial era up to the American Revolution. He wrote a history of thought from the earliest days, the ancient Greeks, ancient Chinese, and so forth in economics, up through Karl Marx. Tragically, he died before finishing the 3rd volume, which would have taken things up through Keynes and through Marshall and so forth.
Yeah, he did a lot of great work. I know I have one of his autographed books, I guess, on banking that he wrote. What about was it Hayek who won a Nobel Prize?
Yes, F.A. Hayek was a student and colleague of Mises's in Europe, was responsible for setting up an institute to employ Hayek in the early days. He wrote some tremendous work in the 1930s on money and on related areas. Again, a very prolific guy, probably best known for his book, The Road to Serfdom, which really helped interest people in free market economics after World War II. He got his Nobel Prize for his work on business cycle theory with Mises. Some people feel that the Nobel Prize people felt guilty. They never would have given the prize to Mises, even though he clearly, if anybody deserved it, Mises deserved it. They wouldn't give it to him. He was too hardcore. But that they honored Mises by giving it to Hayek specifically for the work he did with Mises and business cycle theory. And Hayek did very, very important work in business cycle theory and many, many other areas. And you mentioned Henry Hazlitt. Hazlitt, a very great man and somebody who had very little formal education, entirely self-taught. He was forced to drop out of school at a young age when his dad died to go to work to support his mother and his sister. So he only went through the 6th grade, but I mean, you never would have known it. He certainly had. I mean, you might think he had multiple PhDs. Yeah. But he also was a tremendous writer. H.L. Mencken once said that Hazlitt was the only economist he knew who could really write.
That's interesting.
Economics in One Lesson is his best-known book, and it still is the best book to start with if you're interested in learning about economics. It's so well written, so interesting. Even though it was published in the 40s, it still addresses all the current problems, which are still the same terrible things that we faced in the 1940s. And he wrote the total demolition of Keynes in several books. He wrote a wonderful novel called Time Will Run Back, about the rediscovery of capitalism in a totalitarian society of the future. And it teaches economics in the context of a novel. These things are all on Mises.org, and
it's very interesting. I mean, to make economics come to life, but I think it's easier for Austrian economics than it is for Keynesian economics, the mathematical models, because people can relate to Austrian economics. It's why my mother, who went only through her second year in high school, said that Ron Paul was the only presidential candidate that made any sense to her. You don't need to have a high degree in mathematics. In fact, I think you're probably better off not to have to understand how the world really works.
Thanks to everybody who shops at Amazon.com. I wanted to mention that LRC gets a small commission at no cost to the buyer every time you go to Amazon through an LRC link, any of the widgets on the page for books or other items, or entering through the ad at the top left-hand corner of the front page. So thanks again, and it's a huge help. And Amazon, what a great company. It's just extraordinary. You don't need to go down to the local bricks and mortar place. You don't have to pay, in many cases anyway, sales taxes. So far as I can tell, virtually everything the human race produces is for sale at Amazon.com. So I highly recommend it. It helps keep LRC alive and growing. So thanks to all of you who shop at Amazon.
I told my listeners and my subscribers that they had two choices. They could vote for a communist or a fascist in this presidential election.
I would just amend it to say they had a choice between a fascist and a fascist.
Oh, okay.
because both these guys, despite the rhetoric, are affiliated with exactly the same interest groups. That is, Wall Street banks, big pharma, the military-industrial complex. I mean, go down the list of all the big industries that live off the government. The rhetoric is very different between these two guys.
Yeah.
But is there any substantive difference between Romney and Obama, any more than between McCain and Obama? No, this, of course, is the American system to fool the people, to give you creep A's versus creep B, and that's supposed to be, heralded as democracy. I myself have never understood why it's okay for the majority to crush the minority. I don't understand the moral argument for that, although we're supposed to think democracy is a wonderful thing. But even if we accept their description of this allegedly wonderful political system, they've rigged the game so that first of all, the government always wins. No matter who is put in office, the government wins. But the interest groups, the American oligarchy wins, so that, George Soros, Warren Buffett, Koch brothers, and so forth, they all do very well. That's sort of the permanent government. And every once in a while, the oligarchy changes the little button on their lapel. So maybe it's Obama's smiling face, and then maybe it's Clinton's, or it's, whoever is, and maybe it's, Reagan's. But there's a sort of a deep government, and the guy in the White House has to play along, and he, of course, does very well. He becomes powerful and famous, and he's enriched, and his family's enriched, and he goes into the textbooks and everything. Meanwhile, other forces are at work.
Mm-hmm. Other forces that are really hollowing out a middle class, what's left of it in the United States. I would just one more question.
We're just peons to them.
Yeah, we're serfs, I guess, and serfdom. Moving to go back to one of the Austrians that you just mentioned.
Yeah, the serfs typically didn't have to pay more than 25% of their income. So
we're beyond that.
We're super serfs.
Yeah. Well, isn't that cool? Cruel, I guess. Going back to some of the philosophers, and where did we go wrong? Because it certainly wasn't what our founding fathers wanted, or at least what I believed. I thought that I was taught they wanted. The Declaration of Independence, suggested that in fact we are more important than the state, that we are endowed by our Creator with certain rights. But Adam Smith, was Adam Smith? How close would he have been to Austrian? Quite a ways away from Austrian economics, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, he was a very important guy. He wrote an extremely influential, huge book called The Wealth of Nations. But if you look at Murray Rothbard's History of Thought and other works, you see that actually the best economists, the ones closest to the Austrians, actually were on the continent. They were not only in Austria, but in France and other countries. And the English economists, that it's no coincidence that Keynes was an English economist. The English economists were not as good. Adam Smith, was heavily influenced by the continental economists, but didn't give them any credit in his work, or very little credit. And we have to look to people like Richard Cantillon and others, A.R.J. Turgot. These names are not household names because they are far too free market and laissez-faire. So Adam Smith, there's a lot of great stuff in his book, a lot to be learned from that book, but he had some serious problems. One, for example, he believed in the labor theory of value. He believed that the amount of labor put into the production of a good determined its value. That's, of course, where Karl Marx got that.
Yes.
And so if the value of a car, let's say, that comes out of the factory is entirely a function of the labor that was put into it, hey, the businessman is ripping off the workers. Shouldn't all the proceeds go to the workers? Well, of course, it's not just labor. Labor doesn't put any value into something. I could spend, hundreds of hours making some crazy contraption that nobody would be interested in, and I don't give it value by putting labor into it. So this is entirely nonsensical and really a very dangerous notion, had very, very bad effects. The Austrians showed that value in any kind of a good is entirely subjective. That is, you might love my tie. Maybe you'd pay $50 for my tie. Your producer might have to be paid $50 to wear my tie. We're all different, and it's the value that we have and what we're willing to pay for it. That's what gives value to a good. It's not the amount of labor. It can be a mistake, the amount of labor in something, or it can be a very smart thing, and this is the role of the entrepreneur, to sort of see into the future. And really these great entrepreneurs have a sense in which they can actually understand the future. They can see that if things are put together in a certain way and certain goods produced of a certain sort at a certain time in a certain place, they're going to make a lot of money and serve the public. Adam Smith, he was really a sidetracking from the real trend of free market economics, which began on the continent again in the time of the late scholastics in Spain and Portugal and in Italy, and then continued through France and through Austria. And then to the United States, because this is where the Austrian school moved when Mises was forced to flee the Nazis, and he and his wife, just like a movie, going across France in their car in front of the Nazi armies moving in, and thank God he got to Portugal before the Nazis got him. He'd been condemned to death in absentia as the key opponent of the Nazis from an economic standpoint. And he and his wife escaped to Portugal. They got on a ship. He lost everything. Lost everything he had, but came here, and some great businessmen paid New York University. The creeps wouldn't, even though he was a man of unbelievable achievements and such a great teacher and such a great man, they wouldn't give him a paying job, but they agreed if other people paid for him to teach there, they would grudgingly accept him as a free professor.
Oh, incredible.
So
Why? Why the bias?
Lawrence Fertig and other great men did that, and he taught there for many, many years. Really, he was the oldest active professor in the United States towards the end.
Is that right? Well, why the bias? So here you're talking about these great continental economists of the Austrian school, and yet we hear very little about it in our educational system. Adam Smith, yes, we're told about Adam Smith. I guess at least I was a couple of 3-4 decades ago when I was
you're told about the great economists, Smith, Marx, Keynes.
Right. Those are the ones that we hear about.
Yeah.
Why the bias? Why? Who stands to lose from Austrian economics?
Well, first of all, it's interesting if we go back to the 1870s, the key opponent of the Austrians was something called the German Historical School, which was very, very statist. They actually named the Austrian school as a way of saying that they were inferior because, of course, anything Austrian was obviously inferior to anything German. And as sometimes happens in the history of thought, the Austrians ended up using this name, even though Austrian economics had actually nothing to do with the country of Austria, except what happened at the University of Vienna, and that some of the great Austrians, of course, were born in Austria. But it's not as particularly Austrian in a national sense. So you had this very, very statist school. These people, some of them became, economists for Hitler. Later, other of them became economists for the East German communists, and not good people. But it's not only the Austrians, but really also the classical school of economics that preceded them. Many of them better than Adam Smith, but Adam Smith was good in a number of ways too. if you think of these economists, what they were saying to the government in general was deficit spending is not a good idea. Mm-hmm. Big spending is not a good idea. Mm-hmm. High tariffs are not a good idea. Mm-hmm. High taxes are not a good idea. Cut back. So then you have the German Historical School, you have Keynes especially, all of a sudden giving an academic gloss, scholarly excuse to what every politician wants to do, because Keynes said, hey, deficit spending is magnificent. Huge spending is magnificent. Just spend everything, even if you build a pyramid. Sounds like a joke, but that's what he said in the general theory. Even if you build a pyramid, that's a great thing. Government is spending the money and inflate and hold the interest rates to zero in order to bring about what he said, the euthanasia of the rentiers, which was saying the death of those who lived off interest. But it's important for people to invest and receive interest, essential to the capitalist process, but Keynes hated it. So he told the politicians to do everything these creeps wanted to do anyway, and gave Roosevelt and the rest of them an excuse for it. So why is it so popular? Because it promotes all the evildoers in society and makes them big shots and makes them rich. That's why it's popular. Not because it's a good thing.
It leads people to believe out of ignorance so that they can have something for nothing, doesn't it?
Yeah. If we look at this recent tragedy with Hurricane Sandy, and with popular support, you have the creep Chris Christie, the governor of New Jersey, and same with the governor of New York, but Christie was worse, putting these anti-price gouging laws into effect, so that gasoline station owners risked going to jail if they increased the price of gasoline. Right. And a lot of people said, hey, well, that's right. Poor people who are hurt in the hurricane shouldn't have to pay higher prices. Well, if you put a price control on something, and all of a sudden it's more valuable because there's much less of it, and there's a great need for generators and, of course, your cars and so forth, you have a shortage. By the way, anytime there's a shortage of anything, you know the government's dirty hands are involved, because there is never a shortage of anything on the free market. Right. Things may be very expensive, but if you have got the money, you can buy a Rembrandt. There are very few Rembrandts, but you can buy one. You've got the money. There's no shortage of Rembrandts. But there was a shortage of gasoline. Still is a shortage of gasoline in New Jersey. So you have these huge lines because all of a sudden gasoline was far more valuable. You have to allow the price to rise. What happens then? I don't know what gasoline would have sold for right after the hurricane hit. Would it have been $15 a gallon? Would it have been $20 a gallon? Whatever it would have been, you would have had every guy in the whole country with a tanker truck or people with fleets of tanker trucks sending all the gasoline to New Jersey. And the price would have come way back down, and everybody would have had the gasoline that they needed. They would not have had to wait online. Absolutely. But people are so stupid to believe that you can just have the government set the price out of alleged compassion. Actually, of course, their desire to control. If there's anything about anybody in government, they love controlling other people. They love stepping on people. They love running your life. They get a kick out of this. They let it get a kick. That's the totalitarian impulse. And look at Christie. He's certainly a potential dictator. He's already a partial dictator. He's a potential dictator. Yeah.
They get paid for that, too. They get paid to do that stuff. And
under the table, too, of course.
Lou, I'm talking to you from Queens, New York, and I witnessed the long gas lines. Fortunately, I don't have to drive that much, but I think I sat in line for 15 minutes once to fill up my tank. But you're absolutely right. I mean, I'm saying to myself, the price was frozen as it was before the storm at $3.85 or something at the tank, the gas station at the end of my block. And I'm thinking not only gasoline, but what about water and other supplies? And you mentioned generators, things that people need urgently. Well, heck, the best way to get supply there is to let the markets drive it. And, of course, why is this so difficult to understand? And it's so key. I mean, this is why we're going off the cliff. This is why we're headed into big trouble, is because this very basic understanding of markets, which is so intuitive, it's so logical. It's something my mother can understand very well. I've oftentimes said that the biggest disadvantage you could have in life is to have a PhD in economics from a major university. Would you agree?
Well, it means that economics is far too important to be left to the economists.
Yeah.
It is important for all of us to understand some economics, and why I want to mention again Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson. It's really such a tremendous book. You read that book, you'll know far more economics than anybody you'll hear on television, certainly than any politician. But I think, some economic error is part of the problem with politicians. But they also all are little Hitlers. I mean, they would like to run everything. They love spying on us. They love reading your email, listening to your phone calls, being able to put you on a kill list, put you in a secret cage someplace, send you to Guantanamo to be tortured or whatever. I mean, this is what they live for. These people live for this. They love it. They love killing. They love starting wars. They love sending young men to be killed in foreign countries. They love killing people in foreign countries. They love bombs and planes and atomic bombs and ships and missiles and so forth. This is the real criminal class in society. They make the mafia look like angels. So we want less of them. We want them out of our lives to the extent possible.
But Lew, the American people are responsible for letting this happen, though. I mean, I know you're doing what you can. Ron Paul has done what he could do in Congress. People seem to be asleep. I mean, is it a matter of bread and circus, as one of my guests recently said? People are just, too involved with Desperate Housewives or football or basket, whatever. I mean, why do people not wake up?
This is not a coincidence that people are salivating over football games, which are sort of a militaristic game anyway. That's why the government loves to promote it and have the jets flying over it and all the rest of the stuff. So they promote this kind of thing. This is why there are government schools to teach error and to teach obeisance to the state and bowing down and worship of politicians, and be happy to give them your wallets, your children, or yourself to go fight their wars and obey them in every other sense. But still, the people can change things. I mean, it's absolutely true that people are responsible. But every government needs the consent of the governed, even a dictatorial government, because government is much smaller than the people. It's a question of the parasite and the host. If the parasite gets too big, it can't live it up at the expense of the people. So the government is always necessarily smaller than the people. It's actually possible to withdraw consent. It's actually possible, if enough hearts and minds are changed, that we can really cut them back. But of course, right now, especially ever since government happy day of 9/11, they've been celebrating it ever since, we've seen just unbelievable increase in the police state, the warfare state, the welfare state, the Keynesian state, everything terrible. But I think more and more people are waking up. And this is also the fight that's gone on from the very beginning of human civilization. Think of Cain as the first government. We've always had these types of people, those of us who want prosperity, who want freedom, who want a future for the human race, who want flourishing for the human race, and think that this parasitical institution called government needs to be pushed back, and we really don't need it in any sense. It really is, it's a matter of, do you agree that it's wrong always and everywhere to use violence or the threat of violence against the innocent? And of course, government is nothing but violence and the threat of violence. They claim the right to kill you if you sufficiently resist paying your parking ticket. So this is a very nasty bunch. And we have to organize, not in terms of arms or anything like that, because, of course, killing and torture is their way. That's not our way. Our way is the way of peace and of tolerance and of voluntarism. But if we intellectually organize against them, if more and more people, as Ron Paul, again, has affected millions of lives, if we can build on what Ron did, I see amazing changes among young people that give me a lot of hope for the future. We've got, of course, bad economic times ahead. We're already in bad economic times, probably worse economic times. But I don't think all is lost. I think that there is hope for the future, and I think if one is religious, we were talking about this, we know that good wins in the end anyway. We should never lose our hope and never be pessimists, but always be optimists, at least in the long run. This was Murray Rothbard's rule. He thought that from the standpoint of economic law and many other things, that it was valid and right to be an optimist in the long run, even if facts probably justified being a pessimist in the short run.
Right, certainly. Well, Ron Paul will be leaving Congress very shortly, as soon as the lame duck session is out of the way. Jeff Deist is a frequent guest on this show, and I think Jeff helped to craft Ron's farewell speech. But I want to ask you, as one who worked for Ron in the past, how Ron raised the question in his talk, in his speech, how much did I accomplish? And I would gather that you think he accomplished an awful lot. That there is hope now, in part a large part because of what he did. And to what extent do you think this can help really vitalize or give some more strength to the Mises Institute in this? Because it's really an educational process, isn't it? That's what Ron was all about,
as Ron himself said. And so, as he said in his farewell speech, if you look at what I've done from the standpoint of sort of the regular judgment of politics, I look like a total failure. But if you look at things with the eyes far to the future, and you look at what he actually has accomplished outside of Congress, it's unbelievable. I mean, I don't think there's ever been anybody like Ron Paul in the history of American politics. Certainly not for the good. I mean, plenty of people, of course, who've accomplished much for the dark side.
Sure.
So Ron has touched so many people, not only in this country but around the world. As you pointed out, he's very popular in other countries. He's got fantastic plans for the future, educational plans, mass media plans, and he is not retiring. In fact, I think we can think of him as stepping everything up and building on what he's accomplished. Maybe someday people will look back and think of this as the age of Ron Paul.
Yeah, he's remarkably resilient for a man his age, for sure. He keeps himself in impeccably great shape, and there is some room for optimists. There are optimists in our camp, to be sure. Bob Hoy is a Canadian market analyst who's on this show from time to time, and he's believing that in fact we're going through the ringer now. We're going to see some really difficult times, but in fact that will bring about what he calls a bull market in common sense, and in terms of downsizing and requiring and demanding less government intrusion in our lives. And Richard Mayberry talked again last month about his optimism, because he talks about how America is repeating the pattern common in world history. He says where he believes that we'll go through an inflationary hell for a while. Then the terrified leaders will flee, and America will get a chance to make a fresh start. And I think what he's thinking is that it's people like the Mises Institute, Ron Paul, and others who are planting the seeds for liberty, because if there is a vacuum, you're going to need to have, someone will step into the vacuum. It just depends on whether or not it's going to be the dark side or the side of light, right? So I guess there's reason for optimism.
We had the Great Depression, we had both the Republicans and the Democrats, the evil Hoover, the evil Roosevelt, arguing that there was a Great Depression because the free market had been allowed to run free.
Yeah.
And therefore we needed much more economic controls. A lot of people came to believe that it was the free market that caused the Depression, even though it was the Federal Reserve that caused the Depression. And all its machinations during the 1920s, Rothbard's book, America's Great Depression, is the key work to look at about this. And we didn't get out of the Depression until after World War II. And, of course, the Keynesians would claim that World War II got us out of the Depression. It's not true, of course. Killing the unemployed and destroying property is not economically productive. I mean, it's obvious that it's crazy. It wasn't until the government was massively cut after World War II. In 1946, we had probably the greatest year of economic growth ever in the history of the human race, probably a 30% economic growth in 1 year in this country because of the massive cutting of government. So now we're in a crisis. When the crisis gets worse, there's going to be the intellectual battle. We have the Keynesians saying, we need, the total state, we need the Sovietization, or we need the Mussoliniization. Then we have our side talking about why we need much less government. We don't need a Fed. We don't need U.S. empire. We don't need the military-industrial complex. We don't need the Bush-Obama fascist medical system. We don't need that, and it's actually extremely destructive. So the battle is coming, the intellectual battle, and we're in far better shape than we were in 1933 and 29 to 33. So we just have to see. We have to fight our hardest. But again, this is something that has been going on as long as human beings have been on the earth, the fight between power and market, as Rothbard put it. And we have to do our job. We're called to do the job. This is the time to do it. It's so important, first of all, to understand something about economics, something about history and political philosophy of libertarianism and so forth. So I would say take a look at Mises.org, MISES.org, also LewRockwell.com, my personal site.
Yeah, for sure. But, it is the necessity of learning, this basic free market economics, the supply and demand, and how markets most efficiently clear, and how they allocate scarce resources, as you were talking about with the flood up here in New York and all that, until people really understand that. And I mean, this is because we are really dealing with the power of the state that has all of the resources and the educational system. All of these factories are going up, these propaganda factories, I call them, around the city of New York here, that are really that are really there to form the minds and the hearts and the minds of people away from liberty towards fascism. So we do have a big, quite a task on our hands, don't we?
Yes, we do. I think we're up to it. I hope we're up to it. And certainly we have the truth on our side. That's a big help. Yeah, so the other guys are engaged in propagating lies. We're engaged in propagating the truth. May the truth win.
There's so many good things at Mises.org. One I wanted to ask you about. We're out of time now, but one had to do with why Obama is not a friend of women, or some such topic like that. I had gone over Eisenhower's farewell speech and had come up with a lot of questions and things I wanted to talk to you about there as well. But I thought it was really important today to sort of lay the groundwork and to talk a little bit about Mises.org and the Mises Institute, because I'd really like to have more of your scholars come on to my show from time to time. Various people. Ron Paul's been on a number of times. A lot of other free market people have been on. I want to thank you very much, Lew, for taking your valuable time to be with us. I'm looking forward to meeting up with you at some of your events and letting our listeners know about them as well. You do have something coming up, I think, in Houston in the near future. Is that right?
We do. If you go to Mises.org and you take a look at the events tab at the top of the page, you'll see our Houston Mises Circle and other things coming up, student programs, and we'd love to have your listeners come in here.
Very good, very good. Thank you so much, Lew Rockwell, for being with us, and hope to have you on again sometime in the near future.
Jay, thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Well, thanks so much for listening to the Lew Rockwell Show today. Take a look at all the podcasts. There have been hundreds of them. There's a link on the upper right-hand corner of the LRC front page. Thank you.